You've asked your child to start their homework. You walk away and you come back 10 minutes later, and they're in the exact same position that you left them in. Nothing has happened. You ask, "Did you start?" And they say, "Well, I was about to." You ask again. You come back again. And again, they have not started. By the fourth time, you aren't asking anymore, you're demanding. And somehow that turns into a conflict about homework that was supposed to take 20 minutes and it has now consumed the entire evening. Welcome to the Kyus Bridge. I'm Bethany Haney, and we are in a series on executive function. Today, we are talking about the topic of task initiation. And what I want you to know is that your child is probably not choosing not to start. They're experiencing one of the most commonly misunderstood executive function gaps there is. It's the gap between knowing what to do and being able to actually begin doing it. The gap has a name, and it's called task initiation. And stopping repeating ourselves and repeating the instructions is actually the key to closing that gap. So let's talk about what task initiation even is. It's the ability to begin a task, to take that first action that starts the process moving. Because remember, the hardest part is to just get going, because an object in motion tends to stay in motion. So if we can just get them going, that's really the first step. And it sounds like the simplest thing in the world, like just start, just pick up the pencil. You know what to do. You know the first step. The rest then follows. But for the brain with a task initiation gap, that distance between knowing and beginning is genuinely wide. The child is not passively waiting. They're experiencing a form of cognitive paralysis. The brain is trying to launch, but it can't find the activation energy to take that first step. And the longer that the task sits unstarted, the more cognitively expensive starting it becomes, because the avoidance builds on itself and it starts to turn into this belief that they can't start and that they're incapable. But what we as parents see looks like defiance, when in fact it's really the brain can't figure out how to get off the ground. Now, I want to talk a little bit about an element of neuroscience here, because the connection to dopamine is really significant. The brain's initiation system runs on dopamine, the neurotransmitter that activates reward seeking, action initiating circuitry of the prefrontal cortex. And so for many children, and especially for children with ADHD, the baseline dopamine system does not produce enough activation energy for routine, low interesting tasks. The brain needs a reason to get engaged in those like low interest routine tasks, because it's like, this is boring. Why would I do it? And so then when the task feels meaningless and distant or aversive, that launch system does not fire. And so this is why sometimes deadlines help, because urgency is a dopamine activator. It's also why interest helps. Things that are novel to them, that activates their passion or their system, is another dopamine reward. It's actually why the threat of consequences sometimes triggers starting, because that perceived threat is a stress activator that can temporarily substitute for dopamine. But none of these are sustainable solutions. The skill that we want to build is one that is necessary for lifelong success. And it's the ability to initiate from an internal intention, not from an external pressure like consequences or rewards. Now, it's also worth noting that our repeated instruction as parents actually does something to that task initiation gap, and it's not good. Every additional reminder that we give shifts the locus of initiation from the child to the parent. Now, when they eventually start, it's not because they understand the need to do the task or because they want to start or they have the intrinsic drive or motivation. It's because we've nagged them to do it. And so then the child stops monitoring for themselves when to start. They stop thinking about like, oh, I do need to start this. Otherwise it's going to be late and I'm going to miss the deadline, because they know that the parent is just going to keep telling them to start. And so now their brain starts to wait for your repetition. They know your pattern. They know, oh, mom will say it 5 times before she gets really angry. And now all they're doing is avoiding that anger. And so they then replace their own desires with your repetition. And so those repeated reminders don't build skills. they actually replace the skill. And the parent then who learns to stop reminding before the child learns to monitor themselves is left with a child who genuinely can't start without external pressure. Meaning, like, we've always been reminding them, and all of a sudden we're like, you know what, I'm not going to remind them anymore. It's not going to immediately solve the problem, because now their brain has been built on the external pressure system, because that's the only initiation that they've ever known how to exercise. And so that's the piece that we also have to consider as we try to build this brain skill. Now, this is something that science has talked about a lot. There's things about intrinsic motivation, grit, growth mindset. Goal setting is one of those things. It's why I wrote the book, Growth Mindset, Goal Setting, and Resilience for Kids. It's a 30-day Bible study and workbook that goes through the science and the scripture of the topic. There are 28 topics in there for children to learn how to have a growth mindset, how to set goals, how to be resilient. There are so many biblical stories and examples in there, but today I want to talk about one specifically from Moses' life. So Moses at the burning bush is one of the longest recorded conversations between a human being and God in scripture. And at its heart, underneath all of the theological weight that we typically look at, is actually a story about task initiation failure. I love Moses, honestly. Of the people that I identify with most in the Bible, Moses is it. And you'll see that come out in my third fiction novel when it launches. But back to Moses. So God calls and Moses deflects. Who am I that I should go? What if they don't believe me? I'm not eloquent. I am slow of speech. Please send someone else, someone more qualified. Every response is a form of not starting. Moses knows the task. He understands the mission. He has been given the resources, and he can't make himself take the first step. And God's response in every exchange is not impatience. It's not frustration. He's not getting louder repetition of the same command. He is addressing the specific barrier that Moses names each time. When Moses says, "Who am I?" God says, "Who am I? I will be with you." When Moses says, "What if they don't believe me?" God says, "Here's what you will say." When Moses says, "I can't speak," God says, "Who made your mouth? You can speak. I can make anything happen. I will be with your mouth." Step by step, every barrier that is named, God addresses. He doesn't demand Moses launch on his own. He scaffolds the initiation with exactly what Moses needs until Moses is then ready to take that first step. And the first step leads to the next step, and the next leads to the burning bush becoming the exodus for the people. So the initiation support was not just a sign of Moses' weakness. It was the provision of God, who understood that we as humans have a gap between what we've been called to do and beginning what we need to do. And that gap is real. And God met Moses in that gap rather than condemning it. So, how do we make this practical in our parenting and for our kids? The first step is to notice it. Before you issue the 5th reminder to your child, notice, is this a task initiation gap or is this something else? Is my child sitting still and seemingly stuck? That's an initiation gap. Are they actively avoiding possibly an emotional control or anxiety response to the task? Or are they distracted by something else? That's sustained attention and impulse control, which we covered in some of the previous episodes. The starting point of where it is that your child is getting stuck depends on what you're seeing, and what you're seeing helps define what that gap is that you're actually looking at. And so if the child is just overwhelmed because they literally don't know where to start the math problem, that's an initiation task gap. Now, also, notice what you're doing with the reminders. Are you repeating instructions are you repeating yourself, which replaces the skill, or are you giving step-by-step instructions that move them along and help build the skill? Because a child who has learned that a parent will eventually start making demands, that means that they stop their own internal initiation system, because they know that the parent will eventually fuel that for them. And so that makes independence impossible. They need to know, like, okay, every time I give a barrier or an excuse, mom or dad's going to tell me how to overcome it. So, like, I need to just stop coming up with excuses. And if there is a real barrier, I need to tell them and they're going to help me solve it. So notice what you're doing as well. Okay, name it. So bring the gap out into the open, because when we name things, it actually removes the power or the threat that they hold looming over our brain. And we also want to name without shaming. So we don't want to say things like, why haven't you started? But I noticed that you haven't started. What part is most overwhelming for you? Or what's making it hard to take the first step? And let them name it. You're inviting them into their own initiation process rather than demanding the result that you think is necessary and probably demanding a skill that they don't have yet. Name the skill directly too, like encouraging them that like starting things sometimes it can be difficult for the brain, especially when the task isn't interesting or when it's boring or when it's really hard. Let's figure out what helps your specific brain like launch and get going, and then nurture it. This is how you build task initiation and scaffold parenting around it. Here are some tips. So identify the smallest possible first step and make that the only assignment for the first step, because if you can get them going, that is immensely helpful. So don't say things like do your homework, but say like, okay, open your notebook, get your pencil. Or not like go clean your room, but okay, focus on putting the stuffies away first, or focus on putting the Legos away first, or focus on hanging up your clothes first. The first step that is so small that it can't be refused is actually the step that starts to get things going. So the easier we make that launch step, the easier the entire process is. Once the brain has started, the initiation barrier is down and the next step is always easier than the first. Second, create a launch ritual, something specific, consistent sequencing that helps the brain learn and associate it with beginning. So for homework, this is doing it in the same location, at the same time, with the same preparation steps, with the same brief routine before. So maybe that's like, okay, get a fun snack, get a drink of water, get your favorite pencil, and let's sit down and open your notebook. Now, you don't have to be rigid about it. I mean, obviously life happens and sometimes things change. So if you can't do it at the same time every day, that's where like the routine of the snack and the favorite pencil works. So then by the time their brain realizes like, okay, we're in this routine, that means now that it's time to start, then the ritual signals that to the brain, and then the initiation is about to happen automatically on its own, because the ritual then becomes the activation energy. Third, remove the audience. A parent hovering over a child with a task initiation gap adds to social pressure that already feels extremely challenging to their brain. So give them a clear first step and then walk away. And then you can come back and either check in 5 minutes or give them a time checkpoint. Say like, I'll be back in 5 minutes. Or if you get stuck, call me and I'll come back. And so then that child has a window of self-directed initiation where they start to feel responsible for this. And that's going to be another topic in executive function. But the more ownership and responsibility we give them in the process, the more it becomes easier to ingrain this into them intrinsically. So now the parent isn't watching with pressure and their internal space has the ability to activate. And finally, stop reminding them over and over and over before they ever get started. Give the instruction once, give it clearly, and give the first step a name, and then trust the process. If nothing has happened after the first time check-in at 5 minutes, ask a question rather than repeating the instruction. Ask something like, what's getting in the way of getting started? Or what feels most challenging? Because that question hands the initiation problem back to the child where the skill needs to live. In closing, I want you to know this. Your child probably isn't choosing not to start on a task. They may be experiencing a launch problem. And repeating our instructions are not the solution. Those add pressure. The solution is helping them break it down into a small possible first step, a launching ritual, and a space for them to activate on their own without an audience. God didn't repeat himself over and over, louder and louder to Moses. He addressed each specific barrier and helped him figure out how to get started, one at a time, until Moses took the first step. And so our children need the same approach. Now, don't miss the next episode. We are tackling something very related. It's called planning and prioritization. And it's why your child has no system and why everything feels last minute and how a simple to-do list can actually build responsibility. So make sure that you subscribe so you don't miss it. And if this episode helped you understand your child's brain differently today, please share it with another parent who can also be blessed by it. If you want to go deeper, you can always reach me at thekairos.bridge.com. I've included several resources in the show notes description below. I love walking alongside families to identify specifically what they and their children need in this season and how we can build that for them. Until next time, be well.